Yeah.
Senator Woodland.
Well, as I always say, we're not on the record, right?
We just started.
I'll say it anyhow. When we were told that the vote was 11-0 on the workforce capacity bill, I said, that's been the same case for 30 years in House Congress.
I've only been here for a few years.
Bring back the shelf for Smith and tell her.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. We're going to start. We have Representative Jerome here. We're going
And
to.
Karen too.
And Karen's here, and David Hall's, I think, in the wings.
Oh, is that you?
So this is our first look at this bill.
Okay.
Why don't you, the floor is yours. Why don't you tell us what you want to tell us about the bill?
Sure. So did you want to walk through the bill? I mean, let's talk. Let's talk about the bill. Okay.
Tell us about the need and how the idea and what you're trying to accomplish.
Sure. So, age 64, an act related to supporting creative sector businesses and cultural organizations. And it's to provide grants and other incentives to support creative sector businesses and cultural organizations that have been impacted by COVID-19. So I guess I just want to give you maybe a snapshot. Like when I'm looking at my own small town that I was in Brandon, and that the town of 4,000 people has opera house, it has an art gallery, a cooperative art gallery, it has a town hall venue, nonprofit, a for-profit performing arts spaces, and multiple artists, studios, and independent artists throughout.
A great golf course.
And a good golf course, and a very good golf course, right? And great restaurants and a couple brewers. So it is like a I think it's a snapshot of small Vermont. And Vermont's a work, and Brandon is a working class town. It would identify itself as a working.
And how many people in Brandon?
4,000. So a good snapshot of what this is, and I think this is repeated, and I know this is repeated over and over again throughout the state. It makes up our cultural fabric, and I think that's so important to remember. And it is so the economic impact of the arts is duplicated in rural and urban areas throughout the state. It attracts residents and it brings back economic opportunity. And I'm strong believer in all that. Creative sector represents 9% of our jobs throughout the state. And but the pandemic has profoundly impacted a huge sector of these creative businesses, including museums and theaters and galleries and studios and performing arts venues, as well as in cultural organizations, as well as artists and architects and curators and crafters and dancers and designers, and the list goes on of the occupations. And this bill would help any enterprise, organization, or individual whose products and services are rooted in the artistic and creative content. So during COVID, 8,000 jobs in the creative sector were lost, and the Brookings Institute study estimated that $260 million in sales was lost between April and July of 2020. It's a significant amount of money. And then in March of 2020, the arts organizations were the first to close and are still sort of the last to reopen, and many are still struggling because people are hesitant to come back, and they don't feel confident in coming back to the numbers that we saw prior to 2020.
Was the 8,000 jobs, is there any number as to how many come back? 8,000 so lost from COVID?
I don't know, but Karen Middleman could certainly maybe address that. Karen, do you have
We could
come back to that? Oh, yeah, fine. So anyway, so now looking at this hesitancy of coming back, we need to help these businesses now when they're returning to manage the high cost of COVID, COVID-safe supplies, to reboot their programs, to re-engage audiences, and they need to get back on the same just good sound footing again. Sort of post COVID-19. So the bill proposes to provide $17.5 million in financial assistance to the creative sector businesses and cultural organizations. And I'll just run down the programs. The first one is a $10 million. Oh, first of all, let me just go over this. What we propose in this bill is to fund $17.5 million will be used taking the remaining funds from the Economic Recovery Grant Program, which ACCD administers, and they would sub-grant those $17.5 million to the Vermont Arts Council to administer these grants. My understanding is now there's $25.5 million left in that fund that were not dispersed. They're unused. The bridge grants did not get out in the manner that they had hoped it would. So the first program is a $10 million in creative economy grants. These will be allocated to fund theaters, community art centers, galleries, museums, dance studios, and creative economy businesses and nonprofits. So for-profit and nonprofit for operating support and recovery. It is estimated that they could grant about 250 to 300 grants in a size about $5,000 to $250,000. And they're going to base this granting process. So Vermont Arts Council had a very successful grant, administered about $5 million of grants during the first round of COVID funds, CRF funds. Now, then they're also basing this, their plan to provide this money on a program from the state of Colorado and their economic development office. And
So you say that for this first $10 million, you think that there are 250 to 300 grants go out?
Yeah.
I could do the math, but do you have?
yeah, and the Arts Council believes that they could be in a range from small $5,000 grants to $250,000 grants for small organizations, $5,000, a larger organization.
Got it. Okay.
We know those larger organizations, so $250,000. So another program would be $2 million used for transitional costs for safe public programming. So this would be things like touchless ticketing, online sales platforms, and COVID-related health and safety protocols. And they believe they could provide about 300 grants. And just sort of as a point of interest, the Paramount Theater told us that they are now spending about $1,000 per event to in public safety.
That's what they're spending now?
Yeah.
They're spending
Yeah.
4,000,
1,000
1,000 per event.
per event in order to cover all the public safety protocols.
What theater was that, the Flint?
Paramount Theater.
Paramount.
Yeah, we've had some interesting testimony from Eric Millette, who's the executive director at the Paramount. And then in this section, the last bit of money would be $4 million to be used for facility adaptations. So these are slightly more expensive things like air purification systems, expanded outdoor seating, HVAC assessments, and upgrades. And in this area, they believe that they could provide about 80 grants that would range from $20,000 to $100,000. So, and the next section of this bill is $500,000 for statewide promotion and marketing of the Vermont creative sector. And this is to, market. So we would provide encouraging people to come back, they more confidence to attending large gatherings and performances. And that about 25 to 30 at 30,000 each. And then the next one would be $250,000 to sustain and build the Vermont Creative Network and a Creative Action Plan. The legislature provided funding for this plan in 2016, so they want to hire a coordinator and zone leaders and continue the work they've done on the strategic plan and roadmap for economic development of the arts within the state.
So who runs that?
The Vermont Arts Council. They have a very interesting document.
Council shop.
Yeah, Vermont, they have a strategic plan that is worth looking at. The last piece is not almost the last piece. Is $750,000 to, and that $750,000 is to revitalize downtowns and village centers with vacant storefronts, which there's been quite a few that have come up during the pandemic, and that would be to for artists that rent the storefront and also to perhaps provide additional housing also if that's within it. But a good example of that is in Middlebury. There was during COVID and during their road construction, there were quite a few empty storefronts in downtown Middlebury, just a stone's throw away from the college, and they had a very interesting cooperative program called Bundle, where it was a series of art exhibits, classes, performances, and the town estimated that there was additional had a direct impact of $250,000 in sales from filling that temporarily filling that storefront.
And that program is called Bundle.
What's part of this is envisioned as housing?
So in that $750,000, there is an idea that if in a building there was a vacant livable space, it was safe livable space, that it could be rented to an artist and sort of cooperate with the I guess people were sort of envisioning in a downtown where there was an empty storefront and maybe a livable space upstairs and the artist could occupy the spaces.
And this is viewed as the grant to both the landlord to help finance the transition.
Yeah.
The transformation of these spaces, right?
Right.
This is, although it doesn't say that.
It is to the provide rental income to building owners, enabling artists and creative businesses to thrive and spark energy and redevelopment in post-COVID downtowns.
Right.
So then the very last piece of this is $10,000 to fund Farmers Night.
Yes, this is very exciting.
And actually I had a personal story about this, is that I was Farmers Night, I knew it was coming up, and we have this new opera company in Brandon, and I thought how wonderful to maybe get two of the performers to come to the State House and give a performance. And I had no idea that people, unless they were funded through the Vermont Humanities Council or perhaps Friends of the State House, they had there was no reimbursement for his travel or expenses to come to the State House and perform. I had just assumed that there was, and I was embarrassed to find out that I'd asked people to come and spend a day of their time to perform for us without any reimbursement. So there's a small allocation of $10,000 added on to this bill for that purpose.
This is where our plea to the House Appropriations Committee, this is where it ended up.
Exactly, and it's a good spot for it.
It didn't end up in the budget, which is sort of where we were hoping it was going to end up. But it ended up.
So is it just this is a small part of the bill, obviously, but do you view this as a mandate? They can't do this already? It just says it's authorized, doesn't say that they have to spend it on this.
I
I'm
guess
wondering,
that's
the language says, Sergeant,
But it's not, you're right, they shall spend this, it shouldn't be.
and are they not able to do this presently, the Sergeant?
Correct.
Yeah, so
There's
my
no money.
understanding now is that I did pull up
Oh, there's no money.
more
We've
about
never
this.
allocated money. for
Right, I know there's no money, but there's no money here either. This is just of their existing budget. They can authorize that, they can use that.
Oh, no, then that must be in the budget where we've given them 10,000 because it's new money. It's 10,000 new money. It's not money she has already. So we'll clarify that with the Appropriations Committee and Janet, but I believe this has to be new money. I mean, it's intended to be new money and it's intended to be in addition to what their budget
It
is.
actually says the opposite,
I know,
from resources available within the,
yeah, that's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be 10,000 of new money. So we gotta clarify that.
Right, so yeah, well, there are a number of things in Farmers Night where there are funded, Army bands, the VSO, but there are also a number of performers that just do it on their own.
Well,
The goodness,
because
they're asked.
charmed
now.
into it.
Quite said it.
I know,
They're
right?
quite said it. And yeah, so we felt that there was a need to help out in this area.
okay. Any questions from the committee?
And Karen Middleman is here, Executive Director of the Vermont Arts Council. She's certainly able to give a lot more detail about the need.
So
assessor, whatever. So Stephanie,
Yeah.
in the, Stephanie and I, in all transparency, you've seen our version of this bill, which was exactly the same as Stephanie's. And we incorporated it into our economic development bill because we don't tend to like to call out specific sectors, so we included it in the hardest hit sectors. But I'm just curious, on the marketing, you don't mention in coordination with the current marketing efforts of the state. You don't mention coordinating this with tourism and marketing.
I think that is the intention.
But it's not said. Okay, so that's the intention. I just want to clarify
Yeah, that
that
is the
before we.
intention. Karen, do you want to address that also?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. For the record, Karen Middleman, Executive Director of Vermont Arts Council.
can we just wait when we have you as a witness? You can.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
So thank you very much for your testimony. The obvious questions here is we, in this committee, we sort of have all these things not necessarily covered, but potentially covered in other pots of money. So for the $10 million is carved out, we have $20 million of VETA loans, which the Arts Council could apply for. And if they justified it, they could theoretically get $10 million. For the $2 million, $4 million, we have CIG grants, which may be applicable to those kinds of things. And we didn't carve anything out for the arts or any other thing, but we did highlight priority sectors like the arts,
Okay.
like restaurants and lodging and childcare, et cetera. And then promotion, I guess, where we have a provision in for some new monies, and not exactly on point for travel and tourism. But so did you get was there any discussion about, let me back up and say, I was kind of struck when we did the first rounds of grants. Actually, some members of the business community started speaking up loudly and saying, well, they got that treatment. We didn't, why did they get it and we didn't get it? And so there's a big chunk here of what the amount we were able to find for business recovery grants going to the arts. Did you get is there any discussion of why we're segregating out the arts above and beyond, for instance, lodging?
Well, I think we're just looking at, at this sector and then how much they lost, this particular section lost. And I totally am sympathetic with the tourism and lodging sector and their losses. And I don't think I don't think this is exclusive, and there probably is some overlap with this too, within that. But yeah, I don't think I didn't see that. I mean, when I think about like exclusions and who weren't able to participate, I'm thinking about equity and about small businesses that maybe had a tough time accessing grants, and we talked a lot about that. And this bill has recognizes equity, and this is part of the model in providing the grants is looking at equity and very small businesses, and in the Commerce Committee we spoke a lot about these small businesses that needed help because they're going back early COVID days, didn't have their books in order, were sole proprietors, didn't know how to access programs, had largely cash-based businesses. There was a lot we found out about these small businesses that weren't able to access, and the people and I think we know that the organizations that did access the funds were the ones that had their books in order,
right,
who had dedicated staff to say like, okay, I'm going over the next grant, I'll get the next one, I'm able to apply, and they understood it. And this sector, these are small, a lot of these are very small businesses, and I think, and this is what I know that Vermont Arts Council can do is sort of is do a lot of hand holding and really work with people.
And that's what we did before, right? We carved out a certain amount of money.
Yeah, we did.
to the cause.
It's
They
$5 million.
distributed it, yeah.
But the need is much greater than 5 million.
So you view this, I don't know if it's different for each piece of pie here, but do you view this as mostly forward-thinking or to compensate people for losses that they suffer through?
It's losses they suffer in order to get them passed. So I think my understanding of this sector is that people they've shrunk down the skeleton crews. They laid off as many people as they can just to kind of keep their businesses going or their nonprofits going. And so we need the grants to be looking at back at 2019 and what they've suffered through COVID. And Karen can give those details much better than I. And then help them sort of jumpstart themselves now. Is it too late? I'm not sure. Have we waited too long to do this? I'm not sure either. Like, we're hoping that this will jumpstart enough people so they can continue on. That their nonprofits aren't going to shutter forever. That their businesses aren't going to shutter forever.
Is it your understanding, we'll ask Karen, this is your understanding that a grant could be issued for an arts program that's shuttered down and they don't have to reopen with that money?
They wouldn't reopen with that money?
They don't have to reopen. They can justify that they lost money during that 2-year period. Are we going to give money to a group like that that doesn't have any intention of reopening?
Right,
Well, I
because there's
certainly-
no provision here that they have to be in business now. Is there?
Karen had I don't know if Karen sent it to you, but I received it, a one pager on what their.
I think she said, I think.
The grant, the plan on how to distribute these grants. It would be certainly my hope that when you got a grant, your business will be going on. But they wouldn't be, I can't imagine that we would give grants to people
That
who.
was one, because we have this debate in all areas, how
Oh,
much
yeah.
of this is trying to keep business afloat and go forward, or how much is we can't cover everybody's loss for the last
No,
2 years.
I know, you're right, you're absolutely right. You're only gonna cover a portion. Even if the maximum grant is $250,000, we know that these larger organizations have lost far more than that.
Is the maximum grant 50,000?
250
That's.
of that $10 million pot.
That's what's envisioned in the plan, it's not the bill, is it?
No,
Okay.
No, you don't, they don't have criteria or amounts in. But it is, for me, this is sort of what we did with VITA and the capital investment program. This is in part, I would want it to be for businesses that are operational now, because we don't
Yeah.
want to be giving money to businesses that are closed.
And
So-
in my view, it's an economic development opportunity. So
Yeah.
we don't want, that is,
But-
if I'm looking at it from the commerce perspective, this is economic development.
Oh, yeah, and that's why it was in your committee and it is in ours. It's an economic engine for our state,
For our state.
the creative sector. But I view this division is very similar to what we did in economic development. Part is helping compensate people for losses, but also it's forward thinking in terms of how to apply this going forward for HVAC systems,
Right.
for improvements to their performance spaces or to their museums or to whatever, that so that they can be sort of code compliant and prepared for the next pandemic,
Right.
and for the ongoing concerns that they want to bring people back, because we know particularly the creative sector there's a wariness about returning. There's a wariness about sitting in close proximity with each other. And so some of this is to improve their spaces so people will feel more comfortable
Right.
doing that.
So,
I mean, I think when we've had this conversation about other businesses, I've said the same thing, and I think no one more than the arts will reinvent themselves after a pandemic and, not necessarily exist in the same form, have less bricks and mortar, have more installations, have more experiential art. So I imagine Karen will speak to this, but I just don't want us to hamstring everything into fixed cost bricks and mortar, because there are lots of exciting creative things happening where they're creating tours around the state of different, installations or outdoor experiences, or more individualized experiences that you create for yourself. And we should give the arts flexibility as well to reinvent what an artistic and cultural experience is post-pandemic.
Sure, and certainly, what we also think about some of our larger historic venues, like the Paramount Theater in downtown Rutland, the Flynn Theater. And these are old historic buildings that need to be upgraded so that it's safe. So yeah, you're right. It has to be, maybe more outdoor concerts, but there also are these historic buildings that people need to feel confident in going into. And I think, I am telling the old town hall, is.
I was gonna say, your town hall is a performance space.
It's built prior to the Civil War, so they're trying to bring it up to current codes.
Yeah, I think it's just a both and. I mean, there's really
It's
new, exciting art installations being created where you're experiencing things differently. And like Barbarossa in Essex.
I just had a tour of that yesterday.
Yeah, so, I just want to make sure we're not leaving out new ways of experiencing art.
I think that's a really good point. I sort of want to relook at our capital grants program as to whether that flexibility is built in there. It's not just bricks and mortars, because I think it does say for capital improvements, and there's other ways to do capital improvements that are not bricks and mortars. Or maybe it's not capital improvements, but it's a different way to spend money, but it gets at the same goal.
Right.
And I don't know that it's limited just to the arts.
Right. And my understanding of the capital improvement grants are, and I've just done a brief review of H159, how I'm looking at it now, and is that those are for transformational projects.
With a small team.
With a small team now.
With a small team. So I was thinking like those $2 to $4 million for upgrades for HVAC system isn't transformational in a sort
Yes,
of
actually
broader way.
now, that
Okay.
absolutely will fit into a CIP application.
Okay.
That's why it's transformational now with a T, lower case T.
Okay. Okay. My understanding was it was.
It's
Transformational
not for,
projects.
it's no longer for big regional projects.
Okay, that's
It could be
that's
for
my
a daycare
understanding.
center.
Which is,
I guess I'm
which
2
is
steps
why-
behind.
no, these creative sector grants would fit perfectly into, I mean, that's what we were thinking of as we went through it, is it would incorporate this bill in that. And
I see.
these kinds of needs in that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You're welcome to stay.
Thank you. I'd like to stay and
David's probably gonna, the bill's pretty straightforward.
it is pretty
I
straightforward.
think you walked us through it.
There's probably perhaps a few more details there. Shine, but yeah, I'm glad. I'll sit on the side and David can.
Well, let's hear from Karen
Okay.
first, unless you're David.
And thank you very much.
You're okay.
Appreciate the opportunity to share.
Loved working with you on this.
No, thank you. That's fun.
Karen, welcome.
Thank you.
All right,
Delighted to be with the committee.
it's all yours now.
For the record, I'm Karen Middleman, Executive Director of the Vermont Arts Council. Thank you. I'm delighted to join you all. And I think what I want to say, building on what Representative Jerome said, we worked with Representative Jerome and Senator Clarkson on various versions of this bill in direct response to the continued financial distress we're seeing in the sector. And your committee's already heard me testify about this, so I won't go through all the data, but I want to say, to the way that we crafted the grant programs, they're specifically geared to the data that we've collected on losses related to COVID, on the economic harm that our sector has suffered, also on the continued costs of COVID mitigation, like what Stephanie mentioned at the Paramount. We've collected data from a sample of cultural organizations, mainly theaters and performing arts venues, about their continued costs of responding to the public health harm of COVID. And we've also got both national, regional, and state level data on continued audience hesitancy, which Senator Clarkson alluded to. And it's clear that our organizations they're at about 30 to 40% capacity right now, because audiences are just hesitant to come back. That's consistent with national market potential data that we've seen that says in the arts and culture sector, we're not going to see audiences returning to full capacity until probably the fourth quarter of 2022. And that's assuming that COVID really is largely behind us, of course, and there's no new variant. So just, to your question, Senator Sorokin, about why the arts, it's simply because the sector is devastated and because they're not coming back. 30 to 40% seating capacity is almost not financially viable for a large theater like the Flynn or the Paramount. So while their doors may be open, they may be welcoming audiences back, they're sustaining increased costs to operate in this new COVID environment, and they're not filling seats. And, you know, downtown Brandon, downtown Rutland, downtown Burlington depends on those organizations getting people in those seats because there are economic engines. So that's the answer to why this sector needs to be helped at this particular moment. I know House Commerce heard testimony from Eric Millett at the Paramount, which Stephanie mentioned. They were dark for 18 months and they just reopened in September 2021 after 18 months of zero ticket revenue, zero venue rentals. They opened in September 2021 with their audience numbers still significantly down. And then they had to add the costs that Stephanie mentioned of deep cleaning, COVID mitigation, vaccine checks. Then Omicron hit. And by December, they were already looking at venue cancellations, national tours being postponed or canceled. And I know that in the first quarter of 2022, they're already back down in a deep hole. So their doors are open. They're back in business, but it doesn't mean that they're okay. Very, very few of our businesses in the creative sector are really okay. So we designed the aid packages in this bill as a bridge to kind of get our businesses and organizations back to some level of stability and safety. And I'm really grateful for everything your committee is doing to try to stabilize businesses across Vermont, and particularly grateful to the House Commerce Committee for their confidence that a grant program was a more flexible way to deliver aid than a loan program, and their confidence in the Arts Council based on what we've learned, frankly, over the last 2 years, developing and implementing 4 COVID relief programs. So we designed the package, the recovery package that you see in H624 based on that experience.
Question?
Sure.
So I'll go first. Go ahead.
Oh, I didn't know if that was a natural breaking point, Karen. I just have a question.
I'm happy to take questions.
I'm okay being a bit of a broken record that I think housing is at the center of all of our economic crises right now. And I was glad to see housing kind of mentioned in the $750,000 for restoring vitality. I'm wondering how that kind of small amount of money would help. I mean, we see vacant college properties, huge vacant spaces. And you've probably been to other communities where they turn an old school into artists' residences and do have a gallery in the gym. I mean, what are we talking about in terms of trying to have artist housing and residences? Because I think those could be such a driver of vitality, and it's not a lot of money.
You're right, it's not a lot of money. I would love to see us able to invest more in some co-working and housing spaces, kind of combined work and living spaces for artists, along the lines of what, many, many communities have done, including our own. In Bellows Falls, there's a great example of that kind of combines residential and artist space. What we envision doing with the $750,000 is probably piloting this program in 2 or 3 of the creative zones, 2 or 3 areas, and helping multiple businesses. For example, the bundle project that Stephanie mentioned in downtown Middlebury was 1 grant to 1 project through the Better Middlebury Partnership, which is their downtown alliance, but it benefited 30 or 40 businesses in the downtown. So 2 or 3 pilot projects, but they'll have a ripple effect and benefit many artists and businesses. And then if it's a successful pilot, we hope to be able to raise private funds to replicate it and expand it in the future. I'd love to see that.
But it's not really meant to be a major housing bill so much as a focus on downtown vacant storefronts. I mean, right. I mean, so it could have a housing component.
Right.
If the landlord also had space that they could also house artists, but it's really, I think our original intention was to fill storefronts with studios and with art spaces that would revitalize.
A lot
art.
is thrown into that paragraph, so
Well,
that's kind of
because-
thrown in. I didn't know if there was specific attention. To
That's
that.
because we were working on this together, and housing was potentially a piece we wanted to
We
be.
don't want to preclude housing.
Yeah.
It's part of the
So
opportunity.
So this is yet another example in my mind of the challenges this committee faces in terms of where we prioritize this funding, because we have a downtown credit program, which we're trying to expand, that could easily fit here, that the applications here could easily go to the downtown program to get the money. Yet we're making the decision here to carve out one specific group as opposed to leaving that to the administrators of the downtown tax credit program. Just another challenge that we face here.
I'm not sure these kinds of babies would fit into the downtown tax credit program.
Certainly if you're rehabbing or.
It would fit under Better Places more and under, and some other things.
So a question I have, Karen, is this just for the performing arts or is it broader than the performing?
All creative sector.
It's for all creative sector businesses and nonprofits. So
if I'm a jeweler, I could, even though I work alone and I don't interact with the public, I could still qualify for a grant here?
for some of the grants, yes. If they're, so think of, the easiest way to think of this, I think, is think of the creative sector in industry segments. So take the performing arts slice of the creative sector. It includes the organizations we've been talking about, like the Paramount, the Latches, the Barry Opera House, the Flynn, are nonprofit cultural organizations. And then it also includes small creative businesses that support the performing arts. So a custom guitar maker who owns her own shop making custom musical instruments, or a sound recording studio is defined as a creative business that supports the performing arts. So small creative businesses that support the creative production in our state are qualified for these grants, correct? Does that help?
Well, it's obvious to me that the performing arts that have to perform in public, certainly in audiences, have been hammered here. I mean, they've been forced to shut down in some cases, not practically, but by law.
Right.
But the art world is much bigger than just the performing arts, and I don't know how you elevate them above other businesses.
Well, the creative sector includes museums. It includes other places that have been hammered by public.
Right. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just trying to get at, I'm just trying to define what the art world is covered in this bill.
Well, what the creative sector covers.
Yeah.
And it covers everything from architects to crafts people, to museums, costume designers, jewelers, and the whole range.
So could you tell me a little bit about your administration of the $5 million? Was that enough? Were you oversubscribed? How did you prioritize? I mean, was there any targeting even within your group, or if somebody put in an application and they showed financial loss, did they get their money regardless of whether they had an opportunity to go forward without the money?
So two different answers to that question, if I may. First, that was the $5 million was a program, the Economic Recovery Grant Program, that we administered in partnership with ACCD. And so it was initially run, if you recall, through ACCD. And what we did in the early stages of that program was to identify a set of businesses according to standard industry codes that should be considered for that money. That was specifically, if you recall, for cultural nonprofits. So it was for one slice of the creative sector. It was for cultural nonprofits, not for for-profit businesses. So we identified for ACCD the list of organizations that should be considered for that set aside. And then they initially administered the grant program. Later, because of various issues that you're familiar with, so I won't go into, the money didn't get out the door. And so we, the Arts Council, took over administration of the final pot of money, the final phase. But we were largely administering a program that ACCD had developed. If what you want to understand is how would we approach spending the money in H624, that would be given out by a very different model. Is that what you want to know? Is that the question you're asking?
I was trying to learn from the past, but
yeah.
Matt, do you have a vision or a handout as to what you see, how you administer this money?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things we learned from the past was that the grant formulas that we tried in partnership with ACCD were way too restrictive. I know you've heard about that, so I won't rehash that, but the grant formula and the requirements for applicants were way too restrictive. So we've looked for models for this grant program that were more flexible, less onerous, less restrictive. And as I think Representative Jerome mentioned, we're taking a model from the Colorado Office of Economic Opportunity that was very successful in giving out aid to nonprofits and businesses. And I can send you, I have a kind of one pager that walks through that program, which I'd be happy to send. But basically, it takes the indicators of COVID harm that are identified in the Treasury Final Rule. There are 5 indicators of economic harm, as you probably know: financial insecurity, decreased revenue, increased costs due to COVID, challenges meeting payroll and other operating costs, and capacity to weather financial hardship. Those are defined by ARPA, not by us, and by Treasury rather. We take those, we put them into a rubric, and an organization that applies for the funding must present their pre-pandemic financials. So they're for most organizations, that's 2019 financials. A 3-year financial summary looking at 2019, 2020, 2021, an accounting of all other pandemic assistance they've received from government sources, and a narrative describing presenting evidence of their COVID impact. And then we have an evaluation rubric that we would give to our review panels, because most of our grant programs are reviewed by external peer review panels that we convene. That way we can bring in expertise that our staff might not have. So we would convene a panel and we would ask them to evaluate the severity of pandemic harm of these organizations. And then once they met the threshold of pandemic harm established by Treasury, they would receive a flat grant based on their pre-pandemic operating revenue. So I know I went through that really quickly. I can send you.
I followed it all to the end.
Okay. And what?
They would qualify for a flat grant of.
Correct.
On that pre-pandemic. What does that translate? What is that flat?
So grant amounts would vary from say $5,000 to $250,000 or $300,000. The range obviously depends on what funding is available for the program, but just for argument's sake, let's say that's the range. We would establish, we would segment organizations and applicants by operating budget. And so if you were at the bottom, if you had a tiny little organization, you'd get the bottom tier, you'd get a $5,000 grant. You'd be a largest organizations with the largest pre-pandemic revenue would receive the maximum award, as long as they met the threshold of pandemic harm established by Treasury. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I understand it. I'm not sure I agree with it, but you're saying, so based upon your revenue, pre-pandemic revenue, that would determine the size of the grant, and not based upon your profits and losses or your difficulty. It would just be what your revenue was.
So yes and no, because you have to meet the threshold of pandemic harm. So you're ranked by the panel based on severity of pandemic loss. So if you don't meet those criteria, if you didn't incur substantial financial harm, you're not going to receive a grant, right? You have to meet that threshold. But once you meet the threshold, we're not giving you a grant that is backfilling for specific dollar amount of your losses. We're giving you a grant that is a flat operating grant to help you with your fixed costs moving forward. That's correct. It's a very different approach. And it's one that was successful in Colorado and many other states, which is basically, I mean, take the example of an organization like the Paramount that was shuttered for 18 months. We're never going to replace all of their losses. Right. We're not aiming to backfill to make everybody whole. We're aiming to stabilize our organizations so that they can survive and move forward.
Do you have to meet all 5 of those criteria in the
No.
Just one? So if you suffered any revenue loss, you qualify?
No, it's a rubric. So you get scored on each of those indicators, and then the total score is added up, so that allows flexibility, so that if someone was hit harder in one area than others, those can be weighed.
So somehow there's a weighting system, and you have to reach a threshold of all 5 combined
Right.
to get in the door, and then once you get in the door, you get a grant. based
Right.
on-
Because the Treasury guidance does not specify that an organization, a business, in order to receive aid, must meet all 5 of those criteria. That's not required. So we're just, yeah.
I understand that, but one of the issues that we've dealt with over the last couple of years is that at least on the recovery grants early on, the administration wanted to base it just on lost revenue. It was one of the things that was allowed by the Treasury guideline, and that's the way they went because it was easy for them to administer. And some of us had some problems with that in terms of targeting the money the best way possible. But you're looking at a combination of factors to see the threshold.
Yeah, I agree. It's easier to simply look at a drop in revenue, but we don't believe that's the best way to make sure that the money gets to the organizations that are genuinely struggling and need it the most. So,
Thank you.
I'd like to talk about equity for a second because I heard it mentioned. I don't see it anywhere in the bill here, and I know it's something you've paid a lot of attention to, but in all of these grant making activities and initiatives, I worry a lot about worsening divides because so many organizations run by immigrants, new Americans, and people of color were already operating on a shoestring, already operating very informally. Now they've suffered through the pandemic and are not going to be able to show the same books and records as others and are going to experience sort of even more setbacks, I believe. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about that in the rubric and how Colorado thought about it. I mean, there has to be some measure at some point for equity beyond just pandemic harm to create a better outcome for people than they had before.
absolutely. And I'm glad you asked that because I think some committee members know that in our administration of CARES Act grants and the ARPA grants that we received from the federal government, we worked with Vermont Humanities on both of those grant programs and we used an equity lens. We made equity one of our criteria so that we were sure that we were serving BIPOC-led organizations and organizations in our smallest, most rural communities, that we got a good geographic distribution of grants, and that the other thing we learned as a consideration, an equity consideration, is not just about how you evaluate applications, but it's about the outreach that you do. So having a long application window is really an equity consideration because an organization with a large development department that's scanning funding opportunities on a daily basis is going to snap up your dollars if there's a short application window. And that small, struggling, micro business run by one person who has 2 jobs and may have English challenges may take some time to even learn that you have a funding opportunity. So outreach and time and extensive communication are incredibly important. We've learned a lot by administering these grant programs, and we're not doing nearly as well as I wish we were, to be quite honest. I think that's a struggle for all funders, especially in a small rural state like Vermont, where making sure that you're reaching everybody is so important, but so difficult. But we have a lot of existing partnerships that help us deliver the word. So Clemens Family Farm and the Abenaki Artists Association of Vermont, for example, will partner with us to get the word out. Clemens has hosted funding workshops that we've done to reach artists in their network that we know for whatever reasons are just not taking advantage of our funding opportunities. And so rather than waiting for them to come to us, we go to them and we do a funding workshop at Clemens and we listen to them and we hear what their needs are. And we give them a lot of technical assistance. My staff is fantastic. If I can toot the horn of my wonderful staff for a minute, they do a really, really wonderful job of time on the phone, hand-holding, explaining, help with applications. And that's one of the things we're absolutely committed to.
So it won't be first come, first serve. Is that in your guidelines too, or?
Yes, it definitely will not be first come, first serve.
Are these guidelines already in your mind or on paper as to?
Yeah, could we see the guidelines, Karen?
So we don't have written guidelines yet because we don't have a program yet, but we
will.
I will send you the one, it's a 2-page summary of how we would design the rubrics and what we anticipate the grant amounts would be. That's the best I have at this point. The rest is still in the conversation stage, and it largely depends, to be honest, on the scope of the grant program, the scope of the funding that we receive, because we'll have to scale it appropriate, depending on the grant amounts. And if I might say one more thing, circling back to a question that I believe you asked Senator Sorokin, I'm most concerned about, you were asking about the overlap between what's in H624 and some of the programs that your committee has come up with. I'm really most concerned about the micro businesses, the tiny sole proprietors that Senator Hinsdale and Senator Clarkson mentioned, who just didn't take advantage of earlier funding opportunities, either because they didn't know about them or because they were just intimidated, frankly. I worry that the 2 grant programs in H159 will not serve those small, struggling micro businesses. And then I'm worried about cultural nonprofits. I think the financials and the situation of nonprofits is just fundamentally different than a for-profit business. And they don't always, you can't have a one-size-fits-all formula for both of those groups.
In the Colorado plan that you mentioned, I thought you put in there the word nonprofit. Is Colorado program limited to nonprofits?
Theirs was for both creative businesses and nonprofits.
Say that again? Say it
Theirs
again.
was, the Colorado program was for both,
For both. Okay.
for-profit creative businesses and nonprofits.
One follow-up question, Senator Rock. So I really appreciate the fact that you're recognizing that the big operators will be all ready to go and come in, and they're giving a window there for smaller people to be doing outreach. I think the federal government, was it in the restaurant revitalization program? They actually said only small businesses could apply in the first few months. So so the big chains wouldn't come in and take all the money. So I think it's a real issue.
So maybe a small point overall, but I'm looking at the creative sector space in vacant downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that it indicates is that a grantee may also use funds to lease residential space in the same building. I'm thinking of the guitar maker that you spoke about earlier. If that person, particularly the micro business, the sole proprietor, leases the retail space for manufacture, sale, whatever the case may be of their product, may they also use the vacant space, the residential space, to lease residential space in the same building for a period of up to 3 years for their personal use? Is that the intent?
I think that was the intent, to allow that flexibility, that it could be residential combined with business.
Well, I guess the question that I would have is, in other grant programs that we've had for business revitalization, have we included the personal use of the grant monies for the individual who may be the proprietor of that business? And I don't think that that's something that we've done.
We haven't done it.
And I don't think that's really an appropriate use of the money. So I would strongly question that particular section. Or the notion, I can understand the notion of adding the space in the same building in a downtown area, but I think there ought to be some guidelines and guide rails around that, so that what we're not doing is creating a personal gain from the use of grant funds in these specific circumstances. The goal is to do the grant on the basis of the business or the sector, but not the individual.
I just disagree. I mean, I don't know that we funded everything, but we have heard about startup kind of, like
Matt
how was
Dunn's
it?
thing.
Yeah, Matt Dunn's thing was, we didn't fund that, but we have talked, I mean, there are lots of things where we're looking at someone who needs their fit up covered, like, and usually it's a person, it's an entrepreneur, an artist, somebody who needs live work space.
Live work
We have
space.
not had that conversation. I mean, that's not like coming out of outer space.
Well, I would suspect that if you look at the federal guidelines, I wouldn't be surprised if the federal guidelines would prohibit the personal benefit in the first place. And I think that's just something that ought to be examined. But I would strongly object to it, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's a personal benefit and a community benefit, I think, quite frankly, to have spaces filled. But I think there are many artists, the reason we included this is, if you had a big enough vacant space in a with a big window. This happens a lot in Europe. You could have a studio in the front and curtains and screens and a bed in the back. Lots of artists live in their
Well, you
studios.
can certainly do it
So-
with a retail space, you could do it with a
Exactly.
manufacturing space, you could
That's
do it with
why-
any kind of space.
But that's part of why we included the housing.
But as I say, that's not something that we've certainly thought about including in any other kind of grant program.
We talked about
that
farm
we
worker
design.
housing, entrepreneur housing. I mean, there are a
Yeah,
lot
You know
of
what?
farm worker housing, entrepreneur housing. We have talked a lot about workers who live close to where they work. I just don't think that's an uncommon conversation for this
We
committee.
haven't,
I think it's reasonable.
it's not banned in our previous bill. I don't think it was envisioned. I think it gives an unfair advantage in terms, if the grants were gonna be sized appropriately to the need, you're basically saying somebody who gets rental space as part of their grant gets more money than a person who has to pay for their own housing in an apartment.
I think that's a matter of equity, if nothing else.
But anyhow, we will talk about that some more. I have a question. So I totally agree with you that, and I hope that the guidelines that come out, if the VITA program succeeds, have something, either staggered applications or not first come, first serve in them when they come in. But could you just to play devil's advocate, could you, if we put in our bill that the arts, performing arts or arts and culture get priority for the VITA and capital investment grants, do you, I know you would prefer this, but what is wrong with the agency when they see the wealth of information and applications coming in for them to decide who needs the money the most? So I know we're gonna get feedback from the rest of the business community. Why does this one sector get this carve out and nobody else does?
Well, and we did identify those sectors as a
Yeah.
priority, so I mean, we've done that.
My concern, first I should say, I think the VITA program has great potential for our sector. I have huge respect for Cassie and her whole staff. So what I'm about to say is no reflection on VITA. I think it's a wonderful program. I'm concerned about those small micro businesses and the smaller nonprofits, frankly, that are not, they're going to be deterred by fear of taking on more debt, even though I understand it's a forgivable loan. And they're going to be deterred by the onerous application process, no matter how flexible Cassie and her staff try to make it. And I'm just speaking from experience, having spoken to many of our cultural organizations, nonprofits and micro businesses that have tried, that have, faced those really steep hurdles. And 60% of our cultural nonprofits have budgets of under $250,000. They're really small. They're going to be intimidated by a forgivable loan program. I've got data on 230 cultural organizations. Those are, again, nonprofits, museums, theaters, and the like, that received some form of COVID aid in 2020 and 2021. Of those 230, only 83 got PPP. PPP was a fantastic program. It benefited most of our larger organizations, but 60% of our organizations are small to medium size. And they're just, I worry that that's the group I'm concerned about, that smaller nonprofits are just not going to go for the VITA program. So, and similarly, I have concerns about the capital investment grants. When I look at the language of the bill, the criteria for evaluating grants say the transformational nature of the project for the region, and transformational projects that will provide each region of the state with the opportunity to attract businesses and create jobs. And so I understand, and I have huge respect for what you are trying to do with that program, but that language is still in the final version of the bill unless I'm understanding it. And I worry that once it gets to the administration phase, because as a funder, I know how that happens. You get from the legislative intent, which was one thing, to the language of the guidelines and how it's actually administered, which is a whole other thing. And I worry that program is not going to serve the needs of many of the cultural nonprofits that need really urgently need HVAC and assistance and other facility upgrades related to COVID, that would be fully ARPA eligible, but that they won't get their needs met.
Just a small point, but use the word nonprofits. Would it also apply to for-profits, small for-profits?
In that program, absolutely, yeah.
So
Yeah.
what about a solution? I mean, it is possible that we could allow the VITA program to do a carve out and contract it out to you. At the very least, that would allow VITA to sort of size up how much money they have and where the arts and culture fit in. I mean, we have a $17 million program here. We only allow $20 million. I don't think both of them are going to survive. So if we wound up with $20 million, is $17 million of this recovery money is going to go just to the arts. So I mean, I can see that it would obviously be preferable to you to get the full amount, but your other concerns you're saying is administrative difficulty, the small business first come first served. I think we could take care of that. What we are put in a difficult position is how we were going to prioritize the various sectors and to what extent. And I'd almost, that's one way we did it, the way we did it, because we want to sort of leave it to somebody else to make those hard decisions. But I think to give the flexibility, I mean, I just don't know whether the needs are that much greater for the arts than they are for lodging or for childcare or for all that stuff. And
So Karen, as you know, we took out, and partly because of the ARPA treasury rule finally having come down with the capital investment grant program, we did take out that in the first section. We did, in its definition, we did take out the word regional. So it is, I would hope, and I think one of the main concerns here where I think you would partner either way with VITA is the outreach piece, because you're absolutely right. The outreach piece is going to be critically important. One of the pluses is VITA has, I think, the staff to provide some of the individual attention for our businesses that are smaller, that don't fit easily into any particular box. So I'm hopeful that this could also be, and perhaps with a carve out, be actually very productive for a whole range of businesses. But I think it's totally dependent on the outreach we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think Karen, there's a whole nother direction we could have taken equity that I know a lot of arts and cultural organizations are very aware of, which is access. And you know, as we talk about what's government's role in helping any organization reopen or any, you know, new housing come into existence, we still have to think about who's most left behind. And so I know I've talked to many arts organizations that say they've already had an educational mission and an access mission and tried to make sure there's either a sliding scale or some way for people to participate in their programming and offerings. And I do think that would need to be part of the rubric going forward for what government spends. You know, I know these are organizations that are struggling, but you know, we also need to make sure that what's the value? I mean, arts make life worth living, but are they only available to some people who can afford to enter a museum or a theater? We have to make sure that we're giving everyone access to the arts coming out of a traumatic series of events like we just went through. So I'd just be looking for that as well in the language of what ultimately comes out. Is I believe in funding the arts because it makes life worth living coming out of a pandemic, but only if the equity also extends to each organization, ensuring that they have some sort of access component that they are proposing.
And to that point, the Colorado program that we're leaning on quite heavily as a model here included in their rubric whether or not an organization's community or audience includes historically excluded groups or communities with lack of access to significant resources. And we have equity language that we plan to build into our evaluation rubric as well. So I'm glad you asked that.
Karen, there's been a lot of criticism, as you well know, of the PPP program and how it didn't really meet its intended purposes, wasn't targeted enough. The money was directed to the bottom line as opposed to hiring more people. Has there been any segregation of that criticism, that it doesn't exist with PPP loans that went to the arts community or to the nonprofit community? I think I view those folks as less business oriented, and maybe there's less, the money was more effective in the arts world than in the rest of, I don't know if there's been any studies or you've heard of.
No, that's an interesting question. I don't know of any. I would just be able to answer anecdotally about the organizations that I know that received PPP. There were only 83, as I said, in Vermont. But those are the nonprofits. I'm not speaking to for-profit businesses. But I know most of them found the program, the benefit to be incredibly helpful in kind of navigating and retaining staff. But the real issue with most of the federal and state aid was that it was an absolute lifeline in 2020 and 2021, but none of that aid was designed with the awareness that Omicron would happen or that the losses would continue so long. So that's why we're in the situation we are now with needing another aid package, because that aid it was a huge help, but it wasn't enough.
Do you communicate with your counterparts around the country, and do you get any general feeling of how Vermont's done with its AIDS packages compared to other states? We've had some anecdotal information that we beat the country and how much help we've given out to the business community per capita in terms of our programs. Do you just anecdotally get any feedback on that?
Yeah, I talk mainly to colleagues at state arts agencies in New England and across the country, and it varies, as you might imagine. States with massive budgets are like New York and California are just able to give out so much more aid to the creative sector and to the for-profit business sector. Right close to home, I know New Hampshire just passed a bill called Save Our Granite Stages, which is their version of the Save Our Stages, the Shuttered Venues grant, that's specifically to help those performing arts venues that just are still struggling. And Massachusetts is probably the most remarkable example. They have a long history of very strong, vigorous support for the arts. And they just passed a $60.1 million bill from the state's ARPA COVID Recovery Fund that my counterpart, the Massachusetts State Arts Council, is going to be giving out and making one-time relief grants to individual artists and cultural organizations in fiscal 23.
60 million?
Yep.
Yeah. Right. Well, the news from New Hampshire almost counters everything else they're enacting.
Yes.
Almost. Not quite.
Any other questions?
No, this is great. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion.
Yeah.
Stay tuned. Committee, we have Representative Kimball coming in at 10:30 to continue going through the workforce capacity bill. How did you refer to the bill other than by number?
H703, our workforce bill.
What's that?
We call it the workforce bill.
Workforce. Okay.
Your workforce bill is really a tour de force.
So
It is huge.
Covers a lot of.
And yet, as we're finding out, not everybody. EMSs are, it's amazing that groups that have already come to, at least me, I'm sure to everybody else too, and said, gosh, we have this workforce challenge too. EMS in particular is. Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you.
You're welcome.
thank you, Representative. Thank you.
If you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to provide.
David, do you have anything to add, really? Okay. The bill is really about as straightforward as a bill as I've seen in a long time.
Yeah.
I guess the only thing I'd like to add is that the creative economy is huge, and when on the floor of the House, there was asked for a definition of the creative economy. And in in the strategic plan of Vermont Creative Network, they list over 110 base codes. So I think when we're talking, performing arts and different, it is much broader when we're looking at the profit and non-profit.
This body actually enabled the first creative economy work that was done by the Arts Council. We got the report, we have the report 2009, and it's a huge range. The creative sector is vast and employs a ton of people, and it represents a significant percent of our economy.
Yeah, and so it's great. That's just
So I remember my question, and I don't know if you can answer it. Did one stage of the grant bills, we excluded, or we had language in there that was excluding groups, or downsizing the grants of groups that were about to receive added financial help. What we had in mind was the restaurants and the shuttered venues.
Right.
So one of the things that we'll follow up, I just want to know, I guess Karen's no longer with us. I want to know how much that shuttered venue would specify helped the,
The shuttered,
because it builds upon the equity argument in terms of how we're helping the performing arts, at least the House. They didn't do anything for other grants, but they did this, and then that builds upon the feds who did something special for shuttered venues and didn't do in that series.
that program was totally, are we offline? No. We're on. So that, I just have to choose my language carefully. The shuttered venue program was a huge screw up. It took forever for it to get rolled out properly. The challenge in the reverse was true for the restaurants, which is they got it up and going, and then all those priority crowds got all the money, and then most of our restaurants, like Matt's, most of our restaurants in Vermont did not get any money. The reverse was true with shuttered venues, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie, which is, it took forever to get that program worked out. There were huge technical glitches with it. And I'm actually not sure how many of our performing arts community, I'm not sure how we ended up benefiting.
It would have to be a good list to get from Karen, because some did get, I know that there did get some, but I do know that it was extremely complicated.
Oh, and long and took forever.
And exceeded, I think.
Yeah, but whether it took forever or not,
I don't know who benefited.
yeah, I just want to know how that factors in to their eligibility and the size of the grants.
Yeah.
Because they had an extra pot of money that other businesses didn't have. So.
Yeah, I just don't know the answer to that. Well, let's ask her.
But you will be receiving this, so February 28th memo that the House Commerce received on all of the outline of this economic, of the Colorado.
Oh, the Colorado thing.
And I think a lot of those answers.
We have all.
She said she'll send it to you. It's an extremely helpful memo.
Maybe you could email her. Would you be kind enough to ask her also what the results were for Vermont with the shuttered venue? That'd be great.
I still want to spend time with, whether it's Cassie or Joan or both, about businesses on a timeline where they are completely out of luck. I mean, I know Tom Lozon brought this up with restaurants who got opened like in the 2 months before the pandemic, and when even that whole year of the first year of the pandemic, the collective wisdom was that this was 3 months and then over, or 6 months and then over. We kept pushing out the timeline, and projects, developed and sought funding and tried to, build new efforts, quit jobs. People made moves in some parts of the pandemic that may or may not have federal eligibility. Cassie in an email said to me, it's very complicated. They have to prove more. I still want to know what that looks like and make sure we're not completely precluding those folks if federal language still creates a path for a business that started in the early stages of the pandemic, or an arts effort that was, building its capital in the early stages of the pandemic. But have some shot at this.
Well, the language that we changed in the end gives them the authority to look at that if there's
Yeah.
unusual circumstances. And that'll be decided in the guidelines they come up with their
Right.
joint fiscal office. So, I mean,
I know we're-
stay in contact with them.
Yeah, I know we're giving Essex a lot of love already, but you know, if like the Essex experience is a really great example.
Experience?
The Essex experience is a great example of a really dynamic hub that's trying to create arts experiences and breweries that, you know, we heard from. And just having another example of an arts entity that's trying to do something really, you know, dynamic and new that started its effort right around the time of the pandemic. And as I understand it, outside of committee are being told they might not be eligible for anything. And so I just like to better understand our responsibility or consideration for those kinds of organizations before we pass a bill that just says we're giving money to the same cause.
As you're going through the bill upstairs, essentially our approach was we give general guidelines in the bill, but we let the agency work with joint fiscal and bring more detailed guidelines to the joint fiscal committee. So the legislature, we didn't feel like we could get so much, because when you deal with a business, there's so many different examples that could come up. And so we left those details till later on, but we didn't want to give up total discretion to the administration. So they're still being developed. That's the approach.
Yeah, and you know, and this, we discussed